On today's episode, I am excited to share an inspiring and very relevant conversation for the future of work and the world that we are living in today. This conversation is from a past Thermostat Cultures Live event in Columbus, Ohio that I hosted in the fall of 2021. Joining me for this important conversation is researcher, author, consultant, and friend Tamara Myles. The work that she and her research partner Wesley Adams did to uncover the 10 principles of meaningful work is important validation and significant guidance for the road ahead in terms of developing leaders and cultures. Learn more about future Thermostat Cultures Live events by checking in from time to time at thermostatcultureslive.com for more updates. But for now, enjoy this great conversation that is the currency for change. Welcome back to The Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you're currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps on your journey. I've never been more convinced the best leaders and team cultures in the world are the ones that make time to step back, breathe in good oxygen, and calibrate their thermostat. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now let's dive into today's topic to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world. So, Tamara Myles and I connected. I was sharing with some folks last night at dinner that the most amazing thing about everybody who's involved with this event, especially from a speaker standpoint, is everybody has been somebody that someone else has connected me saying the two of you just need to know each other. And so Tamara is no different than that. A third-party person, Kurt Landon out there, if Kurt from Inspira HR is out there listening, he connected us and said, you two just need to know each other. And so Tamara is not only an author, a productivity expert, an amazing, mother and person, but also has been a part of doing some amazing research around this idea of the 10 principles of meaningful work culture, where they study, we'll talk about it in just a second, but they studied all these different companies and organizations of different sizes that are thought to be exemplar kind of organizations, places that have thriving cultures, but then wanting to study and dive into the research, what was it that makes them meaningful cultures? And for those of you that are connected to the work that I'm doing with your organizations, you'll see that there's great research backing up why we do what it is that we're doing that comes exactly from the research. So would you help me welcome Tamara Myles up to the stage?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so still use this one, Jacob? You got it. All right, so Tamara, so excited to be here, and I just want to start out by saying, are there any, I started out today talking about the big resignation, talking about the big shift, talking about the 9 out of 10 are saying they want to work for a more meaningful culture. What are some of the other trends that you're seeing in the research that you're doing across the country and the world?
So first, thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be here with all of you and you virtually. I think that the Great Resignation is front and center right now, in the minds of leaders and organizations that I've been working with. But I think it's important to think about what preceded the Great Resignation, and that's not something that's being talked a lot about, but that's really the Great Reflection, right? So we all had time with COVID, when COVID hit, and we all, didn't have to commute anymore, and maybe had a couple weeks off until everybody figured out. It was this time that we could step back and reevaluate the things that we were doing. And for many people, it was a time to question, is what I'm doing meaningful? Do I feel valued? Am I adding value? Yep. And so for many people, the answer was no. And I think because of that, we're seeing the Great Resignation. So that's for sure something that I'm seeing a lot. And then another thing that really is big right now is the idea of resilience, right? Resilience is basically a set of skills that helps us navigate challenge and uncertainty. And so most people are resilient most of the time, but there are a set of skills we can teach people to become more resilient, and what a time of need for that. So those are the two big trends that I see in my world right now.
Yeah. Well, I love when we first connected. I loved this. By the way, the research that you did of studying these different organizations and with your research partner Wesley Adams of looking into these. What are these 10 principles? I loved when we first talked about it. That when you began this research, that you thought you were going, out into the wilderness. That you were going to discover the one thing that nobody had ever thought about. You were going to discover the secret sauce that, like, oh my gosh, of meaningful culture that nobody yet had figured out. And really, what you ended up figuring out is that these 10 principles, it's not as if people don't know them. Really, the secret sauce becomes, are organizations and our leaders intentional enough and committed to actually practicing them and living them in value. So say something just about the research in general and like that mission that you went on to find the kind of secret sauce.
Yeah, so Wes, who's a great friend, and I we met in graduate school. We went to Penn to study positive psychology with a focus on positive organizational scholarship. So we were both consultants, had our careers, and we're really interested separately in studying meaningful work. So meaningful work is mostly studied in the academic literature as a individual experience, right? Because we experience individually. Like, I can't force you to experience work as meaningful. I can create the conditions. And so we had found that in the research, nobody was looking at the role that leaders play meaningful work. And so we partnered up and we decided to do our own research for our master's thesis. And like you said, I was like, oh, this is going to be amazing. We're going to discover something new. It's going to be incredible. I saw myself as an explorer, braving new world. And I was disappointed at first when we were coding the data, because a lot of it was really common sense. And I'm like, oh, great, But the more we started writing the paper and coding the data, and the more these principles emerged, the more excited I became. Because they are common sense, but not common practice. And so the more something is common sense, the easier it is to practice, versus if we had discovered something nobody had ever heard of, there would be such a education process before somebody was even ready to change, right? So
no, absolutely. And that's what some of the most valuable research, I believe, when it validates to you what it is that you already in your mind, you have an idea and you know that is something that's significant. We all knew these principles.
Right.
And with many of the teams and organizations, again, that are out there in the world, that when you look at these things, most people look at them and say, oh my gosh, by the way, everybody has a one page of these in front of you. And those of you online that are participating virtually, it's also in the chat function if you didn't get it by email. But when you look at these things, oftentimes you say, oh yeah, well, I know these things. But the reality is, in a world where, again, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention, they're not common practice. So we may know these things, but then we're not very good about the actual follow-through of leading these with our teams or with our organization. So let's focus on a couple of these that all of these are important, of course, but let's, with the time that we have, let's focus on a couple of these. One of the first ones is make a strong first impression. Now, that may seem, again, obvious to people, but when you think about the war for talent that we have going on right now, this idea that culture is your competitive advantage, of trying to attract people to be a part of something that you want them to be a part of when they have many different other options. Making a first impression is critical to attracting people to even want to be a part of your team. What did we learn from the research?
So I love that principle, because it emerged again and again with all the organizations we were studying. And it's also like a really, not easy, but an easy place to start, because, it's really hard to change and implement 10 principles at once. But if you think about, first impressions really matter. And we know that because our moms used to tell us, go to school, like, you got to dress up because your teacher's going to meet you for the first time. So it's something that we know intuitively, that first impressions matter. And so, when you think of a lot of onboarding programs, really are created to just get you your computer, and here's all the paperwork you need to fill out, and here you go, you're off and running. And there's not a lot of intention around creating a meaningful onboarding experience and ritualizing that onboarding. And so we heard from the organizations that we interviewed, like Zappos and BetterUp and Google and Microsoft, that they really think of the onboarding as a sacred moment. This was language that they used, right? A sacred moment in an employee's life. It's like, they said, it's like getting married. It's some, so they wanted to mark that and ritualize that moment. And so some of the things that they did is lean on storytelling, for example, because we know that humans are storytellers. Our brains think in stories. And so in order to socialize people to the culture and the values of the organization, they really leaned heavily on storytelling and had employees from across the organization come up and talk about one of their values and how that they live and breathe that value, so that they could see, integrity as not just a word on the wall, but as how is that lived and breathed in the organization. So that's one practice, but really focusing
some of the clients, by the way, that are in here, and I know people on the line are rolling their eyes right now because I've used that exact example of the time of walking into a company that has written up on the wall the giant word of integrity on the wall, and then when we've asked, well, what does that look like in action and behavior? That oftentimes they stumble to be like, it means integrity, right?
Right.
And yet, if we can't even articulate what that looks like in action and behavior, then we can't be surprised when it doesn't exist. And so, from the very beginning of really creating this sacred moment with a new employee, of being thoughtful ahead of time, is what is it that we want that first experience to be about? And how do we not just do the traditional onboarding of people like, here's your paperwork, and here's your desk, and here's how you make a phone call, and, all of those logistical things. But what is that sacred experience that we bring them into to say, hey, you now are going to be a part of a culture that's bigger than you? And so we want to share that culture with you, but we also want you to begin to engage with it as to how do you contribute to the shaping of that culture?
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that's so important. We were talking at dinner last night about the idea of value fit versus value add. And that's language that emerged again and again in the research, right? They want this collective ownership of culture, which is another one of the principles where you're not just coming in and being told, like, this is what you have to do, but, like, what do you think about this? What can you add to this conversation? And it starts in the onboarding, in that first impression, about really welcoming that voice and not just hearing it, but seeing it and enacting on it too, because it's a risk, right? For people to show up wholly at work, fully and authentically themselves, it takes risk. And so what these organizations do is not only they empower people to do that, but when they do, they appreciate it and take action to support further. So it creates a virtuous cycle of empowerment.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned it, but this idea of collective ownership of the culture, that many of the teams and organizations that I'm with, we talk about this all the time, is that many companies think, when they say, of course, everybody owns the culture. And we expect that of people, and everybody ought to own the culture. But then we start to talk about, well, what are you intentionally doing in order to engage them in that, so that they can contribute their mind and their heart and their thinking in the engagement and owning of the culture. We can't just say, hey, everybody ought to own the culture, but then if we don't do strategic things, which another one in here is operations reinforce the values, then we can't be surprised when it doesn't exist. So bringing our own intentionality to this actual strategy behind how we're helping people take collective ownership of the culture is huge. Is that what you're seeing in the research?
Yeah, and I love earlier when Howard was talking to us, he said, one of the things that they did at Starbucks, and I think they continue to do, is hold everybody accountable for upholding the values and furthering them. And one of our interviewees from Nutanix, which is a technology company, she had a great metaphor to describe how they do it. She talked about it as, the values and our purpose are the hardware of our culture. But the collective ownership and keeping people people being accountable for upholding those values is like the software of the company, and living and breathing that. So she said, we see people like really engaged in Slack, and they're saying, well, but if we take this client, that's against our value of this, but if we don't. So a lot of times these values compete, right? And so what do you do when that happens? And like really encouraging people to discuss that openly and speak up about it and call leaders out and say, well, Jason, you said that we value, let's go with integrity. It seems like the one value but you're taking this client that goes against, our value of this. So which value are you picking here? And so having people be responsible for speaking up is really big.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things I wanted you to talk about, too, some of this new research that is emerging, but around this idea of recognizing the possibility and nurturing potential in people.
Many teams and organizations right now are realizing that they need to do both. They need to engage the minds and hearts of their people in person, where everyone in the room can experience the energy of congregating together and find clarity for the road ahead. And they also need to continue to find ways to engage the minds and hearts of their people virtually with those who are working remotely or at a distance. So, if you are in the process of planning your next team meeting, company all-hands event, conference or culture summit, and are looking for support with a powerful keynote speech, facilitated team conversations that are the currency for change, or deeper development on leadership mindset and an intentional strategy for the culture you're trying to create, I hope you'll contact us at jasonvbarger.com, jasonvbarger.com. It is my privilege and our honor to partner with great people to provide support in these areas. We want to breathe oxygen into your leaders and throughout your organization so you can set the temperature you want for your culture. We look forward to connecting with you soon.
And why is that? I would say that that's always been important.
Yeah.
To recognize the potential in somebody and then nurturing their potential. That is culture shaping and leadership development 101.
Yeah.
Right. So that's always been important. But in the world that we're in right now, where again culture becomes your competitive advantage, and what people are looking for is more meaningful culture. They're also looking for, and I think you're going to share that the data in the research is supporting this, is they want to be developed and they want to be nurtured, their own potential, that's an important part of the kind of cultural ecosystem.
Absolutely. So I guess I just realized that we didn't really define meaningful work, right?
Yeah,
and I think we all have a pretty good idea of what that means, or we've experienced it and we know what it feels like. But the definition of meaningful work is work that we find personally significant, so work that we feel is important and that matters to us, but also that allows for our growth and development. So that is the definition, the academic definition of meaningful work. And so it's easy to forget that other part of it. Humans are driven, we are motivated towards mastery. We want to excel at something. We were having a conversation earlier during the breakout when you asked us, like, what does leadership what's needed in the future of work, and in our conversation, Sonia mentioned, we are all at work. Like, we know we need to do a good job, and that is so true. Like, we all want to do a good job. So when leaders give us that opportunity and push us beyond what we think is possible for ourselves, what emerged in our research again and again when people were describing their experiences of meaningful work, a lot of times it was when leaders, they gave me this big project and I didn't think I was ready, but I didn't want to let them down because they believed in me so much. So it's this high expectation, but not just super high expectation with no support, because that causes a lot of anxiety.
Right.
It's a high expectation and high support. And that creates a really meaningful work experience for people. And the question is, like, what if we treated every employee as a high potential employee? How would that mindset shift our behavior? How would we engage people differently? I'm sure many of you have heard of the Pygmalion effect, which is basically an effect that describes, when teachers engage with children. It's mostly been studied in students, but and they've done many controlled studies where they will tell some teachers like, oh, these kids are scored really high on the SAT, and it's not true, right? They just pretend, and then they follow the kids for a year, and they follow the students, and the way that the teacher engages with those high potential individuals causes them to really increase their SAT score at the end of the year, remarkably, like statistically significantly. And so these organizations, so this is the first study that looked at these behaviors at work. Yeah. And so we found that actually when leaders do that at work, it also enhances everybody's performance, which then drives business outcomes, right? Ultimately, meaningful cultures is great because we all want to work in a place that's really meaningful for us and that we feel connected with others, but it also drives business results.
Yeah, and what I see with the best places that are shaping culture as well is that, again, it starts with that first impression that, again, if you are being attracted and or hired and recruited to come be a part of this culture, that sacred moment that we're going to create on that onboarding experience is it's not just a sacred moment, but we are now committed to your growth. We see potential in you, and we then are committed and recognize that our job is to help nurture that potential over the lifespan of your time here. And so the onboarding process really continues throughout the lifespan of an employee's experience there. And then those of you also know that the best examples that I also see of culture shaping is when organizations also are very strategic and intentional about identifying who are those emerging leaders. Who are those people? Now, everybody throughout the organization, we need to recognize potential in them and nurture that experience along the way. But there's also people along the way that we begin to identify that, hey, let's make sure that we are nurturing their potential and developing them earlier on so that they develop the kind of habits that we want in alignment with the culture and in alignment with the nurturing the kind of person and employee they want to be.
Absolutely.
Is that
absolutely,
okay?
For sure. And and what you said about like starting from the onboarding with the sacred moment and the rituals, you're right. It's not a one and done thing, right? It's not the drive-through thing. It's something that continues, and that these practices, these make a good first impression, continues even at the launch of a new project or when you're starting a new team. And so they ritualize. And the difference between like what makes a ritual is that it's infused with meaning versus like a routine. A routine is just something you do every day. A ritual is something you do, but you infuse it with a meaning behind it. And so that's what they do in these beginnings.
I love it. So I want to make sure that we gather some questions from the audience. So Jeremiah, I know there might be another mic floating around that we may need. And also all of you that are out there virtually, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, you always use the little function where you raise your hand on Zoom. Or if you want to put it in the chat box, we can also read through and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. But if you have questions about this idea of meaningful culture and or the practice of these things, not just do we know these things in mind and spirit, but are we actually intentionally about practicing? If anybody has a question, I want to make sure that we get to them. Yeah, Law, we got a question over here.
How do I keep it loud? I'm really loud, but I can't hear it. So with your research that I absolutely adore and love, the conversation around leaders thinking of everybody being a high-performing employee and kind of bringing them up, did any of your research take into consideration bias and how bias can show up in the workplace, whether, you can think everybody is high potential, but if you have a bias, unconscious or explicit, implicit, how does that show up with the experience?
That is such a good question, and our research did not. It was the first round of research was grounded theory methodology. It was very qualitative in nature, and so it did not answer those questions. The ongoing research that we're doing is quantitative in nature, and we asked some of those questions. We're currently analyzing the data, and we will know more soon, and so hopefully we will be able to answer some of that.
but making sure that we are not bringing bias to recognizing potential in people and saying, which all of us, again, we're human, we're imperfect, and so, and we're going to talk about here in a second, that how do we stimulate progress and seeing beyond that, so that then we can begin to say, all right, how do I see the true potential in everyone?
Right.
And then what is it that we're going to actually do as leaders and then as cultural ecosystems to reinforce that and support people along the lifespan of their development in this culture?
Yeah, and your question brings up an important, important thing for leaders to think about in a hybrid culture, which is the proximity bias too. Because, if you're seeing people every day in the office, but then some people are remote, I mean, there's so much research that shows that the people that are proximal are more likely to be promoted. And so how do you overcome that bias is really important in a hybrid culture.
Other questions that are out there? Yeah, LP, let's get you mic'd up here. And again, I'm looking at the chat box here. Looks like there's okay. Love this idea of the great reflection, first impressions, culture. Love it. Good onboarding is key. Absolutely. All right, LP, what do you got?
Holding people accountable for upholding values. Can you give some examples of that?
Yeah, so we're interviewing the Chief Culture Officer of KPMG. And she was saying to us, we have to really balance how we measure the outcomes of success for employees with our values. Because she said, if we're thinking about a resource employee, somebody who staffs people in different projects, and if they're measured only by how many people they staff, which is really important in their role, then she said we could go down a road really fast where they staff people a whole week very fast, but don't take into account our values of respect and our values of community. And they're not thinking about the kinds of jobs that those people actually want to do and are engaging with them respectfully. So you would have an outcome that looks really good, but you would really have a week of carnage in the organization. And so how do you balance, how do you keep people accountable for those values? And a lot of that is through one of the other principles, which is kind of wiring the values into the measurements and what the companies care for. So that's one example. And does that make sense? Yeah.
we're doing that. I mean, we're doing that. That's part of the anchoring of those values throughout the entire organization. So that, again, if we don't have language and we can't articulate that temperature that we're trying to set, then we can't be surprised when it doesn't exist. And we certainly can't. I believe, many of you know this, that I believe accountability is actually a positive word. Mm-hmm. That when we are accountable to one another, that's a positive thing. That's not a negative thing. So we often talk about it in terms of I'm holding you accountable, which means you didn't live up to something. But and the reality is, more times than not, we are accountable to each other positively every single day. Yeah. And so every time we reinforce those values, we are being positively accountable to one another. Helena, you had a question, I believe.
Thank you. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the world that we have today with COVID and everybody hybrid or remote on the foster cross-organization relationships, which I think is key for high-performing organizations, not just teams, but organizations. And it's so much harder to do it now, being hybrid or remote. How do you think this is going to work?
Thank you for asking this question. It is such an important question and something that I've been thinking a lot about. Thinking a lot about, but also working with leaders a lot on. And so one of the things that these organizations that are doing this well are doing is combining this sacred moment onboarding with building relationships right away. So they try to onboard people in classes, right? Because one of the things that helps you build relationships is shared experiences. So when you go through that onboarding experience together, it gives you that shared experience. You go through it together, but they go beyond that, and they try to encourage them to form their own Slack channel so they continue communicating. onboarding, and also to schedule time every 3 months, every 6 months, and do it for a year out before they leave the onboarding program to connect with each other. So that's one example. The research during COVID shows that our relationships at work became stronger through COVID, but only in our groups. So we became very siloed, right? So we knew intuitively that we needed to continue our relationships. And what happened is most of us invested in the relationships with the people we work with more, but then with the extended group within the organization, the cross-organization, we really lost that connection that we had with people, which is a lot of what causes like the serendipity that sparks creativity. And so leaders are really trying to be intentional about building those moments. And so in hybrid cultures, a lot of what they're doing is encouraging teams and maybe organization-wide efforts for people to come in on the same day and do team building activities. A lot of what I'm seeing is that, that home or remote work is really good for like heads down focused work. But then when you get to go, they're trying to create these environments where, I get to go to the office today, not I have to go to the office today. And then they create these moments at work where it's mainly around connection.
And the other thing is, Helena, I know we've talked about this. The other thing that also we're recognizing as the pandemic began is we just have to be honest about it too, that many leaders, teams, and organizations didn't really do the virtual world very well.
Right.
And so the meetings that people were holding as they were lining up these meetings all day long, right? And so you're going all the way up, and then you're like, oh God, I got to get off, and I jump over to the next one, and then hey, and you frantically come on to the next one, and then the whole meeting is either death by spreadsheet or updates or report outs, and so people were just literally sitting behind screens and listening all day, and that doesn't shape the kind of culture that we want, and yet also that doesn't foster those kind of cross-cultural relationships. And so what some of the best cultures out there are starting to learn to do is how do we do that in a remote working environment and a virtual environment better? So how do we set up and are intentional about creating relationship building opportunities even when it's much better to be in person, but yet we know that we can also build a relationship. We just need to structure our time and our meetings better.
Yeah.
And make sure that we're leaving room and making room to build those kind of cultures.
I have a great example to share of is starting a meeting, like just building 5 minutes into the beginning of the meeting for shared stories. So again, stories are a really powerful meaning-making tool. And what they did is they would ask different employees at each meeting to bring a picture, a personal picture, if they wanted to, right? And then just talk for a few minutes, tell us the story behind the picture. And so people could share anything. And so somebody shared a picture of them skydiving, and then they were able to share this whole other side of themselves that nobody really knew, and talk about their thirst for adventure and where they've been and how many times. And so you just connect at a much deeper level. It doesn't really take that long, right? It doesn't take a lot of time, but it's so important.
Absolutely. Yeah, Kevin.
Can you hear me? Yep. Tamara, thank you for the work that you've done. I'd like to follow up on what you just said. So for us, we actually found that the virtual environment enhanced our culture, and to a point where we actually learned certain things about our team members that we had never known before. And it's something as simple as, and how many of you have seen the cat that's walking behind the person or the child crying? That human dynamic we never saw before. Yeah. So we were actually able to actually see through this box more about the human side of our team members. So to that point, we've now gone to the other side, though, where it's like, okay, how do we get away from the comfortability of being able at any point in time to pull a meeting together, have people on a screen? So have you seen organizations in your research that actually kind of have used it as a both and versus an either or?
Meaning what, both and?
Using technology into how do you enhance the current human side of the interaction of culture? Because quite honestly, there are some people that I never, ever saw before that through the use of technology, I now have a relationship with that if not for technology, I never would have.
Absolutely. I actually see more of what you're saying than the other side, where people became more disconnected. Because I think part of, not only did it humanize us, which created more empathy because we were literally in each other's homes, right? And with the kids in homeschool in the beginning, I mean, I was like giving presentations and my kids would just barge in, and they're teenagers. It's not like they're little, right? So
punks.
Exactly. So from that standpoint, it humanized the experience, but also it allowed us to connect with colleagues from all over the world and distributed global organizations. People who never worked together before were able to work together, which I think added to the diversity of thought in the room, right? So for sure, I have seen it much more as a both and than an either or.
Yeah, and I'll say that my observations are that is when all this talk about the future of work, we're still creating it. And so everybody's forecasting what it's going to be. Well, the reality is we're all together going to create the future of work. Mm-hmm. Like, it's going to become what we decide it to become and what we want and what needs to happen in order to nurture the potential of our people and create the cultural ecosystem that we want. But part of that ecosystem, I believe, moving forward is that we're going to continue to learn how to leverage virtual technology even better to keep those relationships and broaden those relationships the ways we can. But at the same time, there's power in congregation. There is power in congregating in person with each other. So what I'm observing is places are being even more thoughtful and intentional about when do we need to congregate in person and to be in that same space and the energy that comes from that. And then how do we need to leverage that technology even better so that we can have those far-reaching relationships. I want to grab Howard and bring him back up onto the screen if we can, Jacob. If we can grab him, and if we caught him not going to the restroom and actually hanging out. Howard, I'm interested in your thought, this idea of the 10 principles of meaningful culture. And I know that at Starbucks, you all were, before people even had this language, as Starbucks was growing, you all were collective ownership of the culture and reinforcing company values strategically in everything that you do. Was something that you all were really good about. What's your reaction to this talk about meaningful culture that we've been talking about, and any examples from Starbucks or even beyond that you've witnessed?
Well, there was so much that's been talked about here. I think one thing, as I was listening to it, is that you start with values first, not results, right? So when we talk about that, the first conversation was about, nurturing people. I have this little equation that I like to talk about a lot. You grow the people grow the organization, and the organization grows the business. And it's pretty simple. If you miss the first step, you're dead meat. It doesn't work. And so the focus has really got to be on growing the people. The rest kind of happens. But if you take your focus off of growing the people, then the results don't come. And when you say grow the people, it's you're growing them certainly as professionals, but more importantly as human beings, which means that the values part of your organization really is the driver. It was hard to get fired at Starbucks for missing your numbers. You could miss your numbers 3 years in a row and you'd still be there. But if you messed with the people, right? If you didn't treat each other and everybody with respect and dignity, then you're going to get coached and hopefully you could make the grade. But if you couldn't stand up to it, then you didn't have a place at Starbucks. And it was, it's like Jim Collins says, the ones that didn't fit were ejected like a bad virus. And that's pretty much what happened. And we made it easy for our people to hold each other accountable. We used to have a system called Mission Review, which basically in every paycheck there was a little card, and you could write in that card any question you had about, or any comment you had about living up to the mission and the values of the organization. And that drove it throughout the organization. So everybody became accountable for supporting the values of the organization. It's the driving force in Starbucks' success, without a question. And it's, by the way, it's global. It's not just in Des Moines or Seattle. It's in Tokyo. It's in London. It's in Dubai. to be everywhere. I remember one time I was at a meeting. We had a program called Leading from the Heart, and somebody asked, "Well, we have so many people in the organization now. How can we expect everybody to care?" And my answer back was, "How can we not?" And so you have to go in with that expectation that everybody signs on, everybody cares, everybody lives by the values, and if we find somebody that isn't, we try to help them so they get to where they need to be in the organization and be productive in the organization. And I think it's everything. Organizations that get this right do well. Doesn't mean they're always hugely financially successful, but they have an emotionally healthy organization. It's the same thing having an emotionally healthy family. They go together.
And also, Howard, I know this from many of the conversations we've had, is that because Starbucks certainly isn't perfect either, that there have been challenges, there have been mistakes made along the way, there have been things that have happened throughout the company, controversies that have come up, but the leadership and the ability to come back to the values and use that as the thermostat to say what fits and what doesn't fit, and then the response of that, of saying, what are we now going to intentionally do to set a different temperature to get back in alignment with those values, was that was running throughout your time, certainly at Starbucks, but then even beyond when there have been challenges.
Oh, yeah, we've had a lot of challenges. The issue we had in Philadelphia with two black men that came in wanted to wait for one of their friends to have a meeting. They asked to use the restroom, and they wouldn't let them use the restroom. And then it turned into a situation where the store manager called the police. And it was a disaster for us emotionally because it so went against our values and how we thought we were living our values. And we had to react to that, and we did. And I wasn't there at the time. I had retired. But the people that were there in leadership positions, they didn't hesitate. There was not one second of hesitation. Immediately, the leadership got on the airplane, went, talked to local leaders, talked to the people, did what we needed to do, and then we closed the stores for a day to reinforce what really mattered in the organization. And made a huge mistake, but what came out of it was a lot of learning and forward progress.
Buddy, keep hanging in. This is great insight to have you with us, sitting there in your comfy chair there, buddy. You look comfy. I want to pause for a second to see if there are any other questions that are out there, maybe in the chat box.
I did see a question in the chat earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if I can read it. Denise, do you see that?
When we talk about storytelling, is it impersonal to have videos on an employee's first day from senior leaders and fellow employees talking about their experiences?
Is it
impersonal? So to have videos, to have that kind of thing is a part of that kind of sacred moment. What's your thought on that?
I don't think so. You mean not synchronous, asynchronous videos? Yeah. No, I think leaders are doing that. One of the organizations that we studied who has since then evolved their onboarding program is using those tools, right? You have to rely on technology. So they're using videos and collecting the stories, but they also have the live component as well. So some of the way that these organizations see onboarding is actually that it starts like the minute they get the offer. So BetterUp, for example, the minute the employee gets the offer, everybody in the organization connects with them on LinkedIn. They get on Slack and they welcome them. I'm so excited to have you. They get a swag bag and they have a list of books that, these are the books that shape our culture. We'd like you to read it. So it starts before the first day.
Yeah, absolutely. And Denise, by the way, I know that question coming from Elford, which also a great spot. What I would say about that is the places that are doing it well, again, that I've experienced, are ones they're leveraging technology to certainly do powerful storytelling. If it's just come in a room and sit behind a screen and just watch video after video after video, they might not get the flavor of what you're trying to create. But if it's really well done video, which we're fortunate to have some great videographers a part of this thing, that when it's done really well, it can be captivating and the storytelling can be really, really good. But in tandem with what is that in-person experience that you bring to people and that relationship building of connecting to the individual human being. for the Columbus Regional Airport Authority. You touched on retention a bit. I'd like to share that I've spent over 20 plus years with my organization. It is my experience, I believe, that oftentimes people choose to stay and grow with their employer for a variety of reasons. One that I think can be, moved down on me, remembering the ending of their career. Others are celebrated. It's moving on me again. Hold on. Wow, that could be me. My opinion would be organizations are great when they have a focus or a transparent plan on benchmarking. People want to know that the time they put into the organization and they help participate in, that they feel valued and appreciated. Absolutely, Tim. That's a great comment. And making sure that we're establishing those kind of benchmarking things is certainly really, really important.
Absolutely. And this experience of feeling valued is the number one reason right now, based on a survey by McKinsey, 56% of people report that they are leaving. So the Great Resignation, they're leaving because they don't feel valued by their manager. And the second most important reason is they don't feel like they belong in their organization. And again, to make somebody feel valued, right? So when psychologists study mattering, the concept of mattering, they define it as two things, is feeling valued and respected, but also having the ability to add value, right? And it's, it's very virtuous cycle. And so as a manager, as a leader, it's so overlooked to go to somebody and say, wow, thank you for this great work. Because of what you did, we were able to do X, Y, and Z. We take it for granted that, my team knows because I talk about them all the time. Like, my team is stellar and my team is a rock star. But it's actually going to the individual and letting them know that you appreciate them and how. So it's that they matter, but how they matter. So connecting the work that they do to that bigger purpose, right? And it doesn't have to be something nonprofit, like saving lives at hospitals. Every job can be meaningful because we all work in organizations that are contributing to the world in a way. So making that direct line to what you do and the impact it has is one of the most powerful ways to make work meaningful and make people feel valued.
This is fantastic. I'm so excited that you are here, Tamara, and sharing this with us. We're going to build on this conversation, so this is just the beginning of this conversation. But would you guys clap for Tamara for joining us and being a part of this?
Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast or social media platform you're using, and share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of these conversations. That way, this spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or developing leaders and culture would be helpful to you and your organization, please contact us at jasonvbarger.com. jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we are all ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work. We have to own the vision we want to be a part of. The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.